Okay, welcome to our panel. It's entitled The Indictment of the American Criminal Justice System and a New Criminology of Hope. I do want to introduce myself as a critical Marxist and radical criminologist who for many years thought that he knew some things about the world and about criminal justice and criminology. Having been schooled in with such critical criminologists as William Chambliss and Richard Quinney and alike, I certainly thought that I could understand criminal justice from a perspective that was different, that engaged the people who had power and wealth and who passed laws to actually promote their own interests and their own property rights. However, I think that today in this panel is an absolute public acknowledgement on my part that there has been a missing piece for me as an intellectual and as a scholar and as an activist. And that missing piece certainly has been the failure on my part, and I think symbolically on the Left Forum's part, to hear from the young voices of the new criminologists of people of color. And what this panel, more than anything else, represents is an ability to actually step back and then begin to hear from new criminologists, individuals of color who can bring their perspectives to bear. I mentioned to Joe, who's filming, that I've been attending the Left Forum for probably about 30 years. When it was originally called, I think, and maybe it was called something else before that, the Socialist Scholars Conference, and it was held at the Borough of Manhattan Community College. And I often thought that the one thing that was missing at the Left Forum, and certainly the one thing that was missing on the left, was an acknowledgement and an understanding and empowerment of the young voices of color that can learn and teach from all of us collectively together. So today's panelists, I think we're all going to be quite enriched by what we can hear from them. I'm going to allow each of them in their own way to identify themselves, but I will say one personal thing about each because I know each of them quite well. Whitney, raise your hand, Whitney, over there, is a young woman who is engaged in empowerment actions not only in New York City but in Los Angeles, a passionate optimist, someone who is always engaging young people and trying to empower young people in a major and positive way. Jason, sitting next to her, is someone who I respect in a wide variety of ways. He rejects things that are not important. He rejects things that have no relevance. He rejects things that don't interest him in any kind of way. I know this for a fact, and he can tell you how I know it if he decides to tell you that on his own regard. The opposite, though, is true. The things that matter, the things that are relevant, the things that or need to be addressed are the things that sustain him intellectually and emotionally. And I actually have learned much from Jason in terms of seeing his approach to the world. Sean, who's sitting next to Jason, is often very quiet, very reflective, very radical, very active, very confrontative in a way that I respect and in a way that enriches me for knowing him. And I feel honored to actually be on a panel that introduces such young, strong voices of color that speak not only as public criminologists and public intellectuals, but I hope that will represent a new force in the Left Forum in an aggressive, positive, and meaningful way.
The contemporary issues that we're facing as far in the criminal justice system in regards to excessive police behavior, excessive force in Ferguson, Baltimore, and in inner cities throughout the nation, it kind of brings me to an article that I recently read. It's called The Emergence of the Shadow Carceral State by Beckett and Merikawa. And in that article, they talk about how the criminal justice system operates beyond confines of criminal law and justice institutions, meaning that the punitive nature of the criminal justice system nowadays oftentimes has expanded its penal power to punish individuals based on not always the criminal law, so civil infractions. We see in Ferguson how their police department often targeted, poor communities, and they subjected them to excessive stops, gave them tickets which they couldn't oftentimes afford to pay, which often resulted in them, having warrants. Me and Jason actually went to Ferguson. We talked to a lot of residents in Ferguson, and they were pretty much telling us that, for the most part, a lot of the citizens have warrants, and a lot of times it's because of this emergence of the shadow carceral state, which preys on poor people. It preys on their position, their position and status in society of not being able to pay for civil fines and infractions, and it results oftentimes in them being incarcerated because of their inability to pay for fines and fees. We see this with in regards to child support laws. If you don't pay child support, if you don't have a job, sometimes you're going to have to serve time in jail for your inability to pay for fines attached, which used to be civil infractions. Now, oftentimes, it can result in you serving time in jail and prison. And Mary Kawa and Beckett also, focus on immigration. How a lot of times, it was immigration charges were oftentimes, handled at the administrative level, not the criminal level. Now, a lot of times we can punish, we can subject illegal immigrants to we can house them in jails throughout the nation without, giving them due process, and we can deport them. And it's becoming, this carceral state is growing and expanding, and I just think that Ferguson and Baltimore and Cincinnati, other cities that have had Justice Department investigations, are kind of coming out with the same results, and they're providing evidence of this expansion of the shadow carceral state. So I think that article is kind of timely in what's going on throughout the nation. I'm not sure how many of you were at the closing plenary last night. Raise of hands if you were.
I watched on TV.
Okay. Glenn Ford, he was here earlier. I was hoping that he would have stayed for this panel, but unfortunately, I guess he had other plans. But he talked about the militarization of police, but he talked about it in a way that really hasn't been focused on, I guess, by scholars. Peter Kraska, who's a criminologist, talks about the militarization of police, and he's a critical scholar. And there's also a book on the militarization of police. But what I liked about what Glenn Ford had to say was that, this is nothing, when we talk about the militarization of police, we talk about it from when we talk about the use of military equipment, the mass, the weaponry, and we don't really talk about it from a perspective of blacks have always been subject to the militarization of policing in their communities. This is nothing new. You look in the 60s, you look at the response to the civil rights movement. This is nothing new. So when we talk about it, when we look at what happened in Ferguson, this is really nothing new. But when a lot of scholars look at it in criminology and criminal justice, they look at how we're using military type equipment to conduct raids and what have you. But this is nothing new. It's been happening in inner cities for since the 60s. So this is nothing new. I thought that was important how Glenn Ford touched on that, because it's a topic that often is ignored in the literature and in criminology. And as a criminologist myself, I like to look at the historical perspective of some of the contemporary issues that we face. Another issue that kind of that I want to hone on in is, as far as, 'cause I'm a criminologist, so I study criminology, sociology, but when we try to explain crime, what I've noticed as a student, I'm a doctoral student currently, and I've noticed that even from undergrad to my master's program and currently, a lot of the texts that we use, the criminological theory textbooks, oftentimes don't really feature black thought in regards to crime and criminality. We look at W.E.B. Du Bois. He was huge on when he talked about crime in Philadelphia. We look at Ida B. Wells when she talked about lynching. We look at even the contemporary scholars. If you look at Hilary Potter, she talks about black feminist criminology.
Who will be here after this panel, by the way? There's another panel after this, and she'll be here. But go ahead, I'm sorry.
You look at one of my professors at Texas Southern, where I'm currently studying at, Dr. Dan, with his seminal theory of petit apartheid, but he has a recent theory which is called Black Social Control Resistance Afrocentrism. You don't really see these theories, in major criminological theory textbooks, which is a huge disservice to the field and to criminological thought, because a lot of times, criminological theory textbooks focus on criminality, black crime, urban crime, which is synonymous with black crime, inner city crime, and they don't really give insights into black criminological thought. So I think it's important, like Dr. Calathes was saying, like a lot of the participants on the panel at the plenary last night spoke about, was that as black scholars, we need to reclaim our space, but at the same time, academia needs to embrace our voices and allow our thoughts and ideas to be accepted and passed on to the mainstream society and mainstream academia. I went to a panel yesterday with David Brotherton, who's he's a criminologist here at John Jay and at the Graduate Center, sociologist, and he's a well-known gang researcher, and actually he had King Tone, Antonio Fernandez, who's actually a former Latin King gang member in the early 90s in New York City. And it was an amazing panel because he was able to, connect his research to real life, what's happening. He was able to have what Stevenson calls proximity to his research topic. He was able to, which is why ethnographic research is important in criminology and criminal justice, because oftentimes our field is highly quantitative, and we kind of ignore the qualitative work. And as far as like the major journals within our field, we kind of give show favoritism towards the more quantitative journals. So I think it's important that when we're looking at issues related to injustice and racism, capitalism, and white supremacy, we should take a grounded approach and look at who's suffering from these disparities and injustices in society, and kind of contextualize their experiences, because oftentimes the policies that we have on the books are written by people who don't know what it's like to be oppressed, poor, and targeted by the criminal justice system and other racist systems and social systems in society.
I want to share with you guys some components from an op-ed that I had written the other day at the Hampton Institute, which is also another, I don't know how many of you guys visit like social commentary websites like Truth Out, things of that sort. But, I'm sorry, raising your hand to say that you do. But the Hampton Institution is definitely another site that you want to bookmark and put on your lists. I'm the chair of the criminal justice department there, but we have over like 10 different areas where people write. So like history, poli-sci, religion, so forth and so on. But the title of this op-ed was on the unasked question of morality in police shootings of black bodies.
Just mention the site.
The Hampton Institution, if you want to write it, .org. Yeah, hamptoninstitution.org. So the title again, on the unasked question of morality in police shootings of black bodies. I think specifically on the left, and this is not only within criminology, but just within, leftist politics, right, discourses. I think there definitely needs to be some sort of paradigm shift in terms of how we contextualize the criminal justice system, because frankly, I think we need to speak more as to the illegitimacy of this system, because it's not really a system of justice, right? I mean, any system of justice that perpetuates inequality doesn't deserve to be associated with the true definition or the true essence of what justice is. So I want to just read the first paragraph just to open it up. I wrote, in the past year, much has happened regarding police shootings of black bodies. And the majority of these shootings, as we know, go unpunished. They go unpunished due to defensive statements such as, I follow procedure, right? And then very recently in Lyndhurst, New Jersey, 5 minutes away from me, a black male was shot, killed in the library of all places, where there were children. But But these defensive statements, such as "I follow procedures" or "I feared for my life," they're easily justifiable to the American public. But always seem to be applied in instances where black bodies are being shot, right? Yet we as a society do very little to contextualize the impact such defensive statements have on our collective consciousness and morality. So the whole entire purpose of this op-ed was to sort of look at the criminal justice system from a moralistic framework. Thus morality, to many on the margins, those who are mostly impacted by this, right, is non-existent at the foundation of the criminal justice system. In many of the laws that govern society, specifically the laws that disproportionately target the poor, right? And yesterday I was at another panel and somebody asked the question of intersectionality, which probably should have been a question of intercontextuality, because although we often speak widely on, black bodies being shot and things of that sort, I think it's important too to give voice to Appalachia, right? And how they are governed, because how poor whites are governed, right? I think part of capitalism it sort of exists within its framework that the others have to be governed, right? And so we need to speak more on this intercontextuality. I think this is another way to bring more people into our collective consciousness in terms of understanding that this system is truly illegitimate. I mean, you were targeted as well. For example, the war on drugs. Historically, it has targeted people of color, but now increasingly whites too are being sent to prison for decades. Especially with the meth thing happening now in Middle America, for example. They're being targeted in that framework. So we need to attack the system from a moralistic framework. I think this is the only way, to really sort of open up the minds and consciousness of others, right? Because most of the time we're stuck in this sort of legality of justice, right? So just let it go through the machine and, justice will be served. The jury will hear it, right? A judge will rule, so forth and so on. But what we consistently are finding is that the outcome is not a moral outcome. Right? I mean, any real justice system should be looking for moral outcomes, right? Not these immoral outcomes where, for example, in Cleveland, 2 black individuals in the car can be shot, 149 times, and yet the officer who stood on the hood and shot 40-something shots into the car goes free. What is moral about something like that? And yet, the justice system is supposed to be our sort of moral access, if you will, supposed to, achieve justice, administer justice, and yet nobody's going to be punished for that. In fact, the judge in the case, let me get the quote. Judge John P. O'Donnell, this is what he said, quote, "I will not sacrifice him," the officer, to a public frustrated by historical mistreatment at the hands of other officers. Therefore, rendering him, I guess, completely detached from, the whole entire situation, even though he was the one cop who did stand on the hood and shot. So now, if you were truly afraid of your life, certainly you wouldn't run toward the car and stand on the hood and shoot 40-something shots into the car. Now, does that sound like somebody who was afraid for his life? And so we need to look at this from a moralistic framework. I think that is what's needed right now. Not only, like I said, within academia, but also just within leftist discourses writ large. Because, and I've been coming here, since undergraduate, right? A couple of years now, not as long as you two. But I've been coming here since my undergraduate years and was introduced to it by Dr. Calathes, who was one of my professors, by the way. And yet you've never seen really, many discussions on the criminal justice system. The left talks about Marxism, right, class and things of this sort, but you never really hear much about the justice system. And so this needs to become part of those discourses, because real lives are being harmed, real families are being broken up. And I further go in here and talk about how we need to contextualize the criminal justice system as a tool or mechanism of violence, because that's what it is. Okay, we have police officers, for example, to stop and frisk here in New York. People's rights are being violated left and right. This was the case in Ferguson. I was down in Ferguson doing interviews. I'm a qualitative criminologist, and nobody believed what these people were saying until the report came out. But why couldn't we believe them, prior to the report? And I'm speaking of the DOJ report that I'm sure everyone is aware of. which for the most part validated everything that the people of Ferguson were saying, that they were being unjustly pulled over, all of the legal extortion that went on. These people basically paid for all of the municipal services in that town. Yet you do have a large portion of whites who, of course, weren't stopped, were not harassed, and were not legally extorted. And again, this is all corroborated in the report. But I think, again, what's important to note here is that these are things that the citizens of Ferguson were complaining about long before the DOJ report. So why does it take a DOJ report in order to get people to finally open up their minds and their consciousness and see that, well, listen, this is not some vast, large conspiracy that black people were making up, nor is it new, as you said. Right? It's really quintessentially American. We've always been brutalized. We've always been the foremost target of state-sponsored violence, right? And in today's society, it's just taken a new form. Now it's through police, right? Or vigilantes like Zimmerman. And so we need to speak more to the fact that this system is not a legitimate system, right? It harnesses all kinds of violence against certain people. For example, I mentioned the police violence, but then we also need to talk about prisons. What's going on in the prisons? These people are treated like dogs in a prison, but yet these are the people who are we can very easily sort of like dispose them, right? Because we conceptualize them, we see them as criminals who are not deserving of human rights. But then we dare talk about what Iran is doing or what China's doing, right? The left needs to highlight this. When you're looking at sentencing, right? We know the sentencing disparities by race and class. And again, just to speak to that intercontextuality, because if you bring up race, you may turn some people off, right? But then we need to remind our white brothers and sisters that, well, guess what? If you're not part of the billionaire class, you too are impacted by this. Your taxes also go into this machinery that fuels private prisons in the reentry industrialization complex, where you do have these agencies, right? These so-called nonprofit or private agencies that use tax dollars, our money, our public tax dollars, off the backs of criminals. Right? So, and typically we think of just the private prisons, right, as this sort of this force that feeds off public dollars and supposed to be, rehabilitating the prisoners, although we know that's not the case. But you also have that reentry industrialization complex that I think we need to begin to underscore as well. You also have private probation and parole agencies, right? And we know that none of these mechanisms are working. These people are not rehabilitated, right? Because they go back. The studies have shown, Jeremy Travis, the president of this institution, who's one of the foremost scholars on prisoner reentry, has shown that oftentimes they go back within about almost 70 to 80% of them go back within 3 years anyway. So the prison experience has been an utter failure. We really need to abolish prisons. I'm with Angela Davis on that one. Right, we really need to get rid of them. They do no good. They serve no purpose in modern society. We also need to look at the immoral laws that governs us. Right. So, for example, the war on drugs and all of these other stupid and sadistic laws that really does nothing to protect society. If anything, makes certain communities worse. Right, because all of this violence that we see in the black community, in the urban community, really wasn't a thing until the 80s with this war on drugs. Right, prior to that, we were pretty much good to go. And also procedures. And again, as I mentioned, just being able to say that I feared for my life and being and avoiding justice. I mean, there is something really immoral about that. That you can say that, well, he had a knife, and that's why I shot him, and you not go to prison. There is something really immoral about that. And we need to stop accepting this majoritarian trickery, right? And this legality of justice, and we need to start rejecting it. We need to do quite the opposite. And I noted Ferguson for that. But also, and I mentioned private prisons and all of that. And also the hyper-surveillance of our society, right? We need to, the NSA, I think, was just the last thing featured in the media, if you will, not to cite them as a source. But we need to be against all of these things, and we need to frame it within the context of immorality, that this system is immoral, and therefore it doesn't deserve to exist. Now, where do we go from there? Maybe we just rebuild a different system, right? But one that will be based truly on moral ideals, and humanity, human rights. because that's what needs to happen here. You know, the violence of this system destroys individuals. Once they go into prison, and again, we forget about the context of the prison. People are raped in there, and this is all noted within the research. They contract all kinds of diseases, come back out into society, they give these diseases to their families. This does not help society in any kind of way. I mean, this is really a public health problem. It really is. Because these people are released back into society with all kinds of psychological abnormalities and what have you. Not to mention the fact that they then come out as social outcasts, who are then, now you can't go back to the projects. If you lived in public housing, you're banned from there. So any system that produces this kind of inequality should not be called a justice system. Because this newfound reality that they have, and this is eloquently noted in Michelle Alexander's book, is as a result of coming in contact with a so-called justice system. How is that justice? That after I serve my time, pay my dues, I come out and now I can't even go back home. I can't find a job. It almost forces one to continue to engage in a cycle of crime, right? Because these are my circumstances. What else can I do? You want me to become a productive member of mainstream society, but you stripped away everything. And then, you know, God forbid they're black or Latino or any of their minority classes, because then this just further complicates their reality and existence. And so we need to look at, excuse me, we need to look at these acts of violence for what they are. Let's not even talk about the impact this has on children, how it predisposes juveniles to crime. Because if you're taking mommy and daddy out of the house, well, what are they to do? Yet the right often argues family values and, you know, all this other hogwash. But for some reason, they can't seem to see how the immorality of this system, right, induces people into a state of poverty, hopelessness, and therefore Baltimore's and Ferguson's, right? And I know historically, we often look at the males being taken out of the home, but this is now increasingly impacting women as well, particularly women of color, with black women leading the way. And what this does is it destroys families, and a so-called justice system that destroys families ought not be called the justice system. So I hope that's enough to sort of engage you, you know, when we move on to our discussion portion of the panel. But there needs to be a large-scale movement, and I think we're doing that in some way, right? When you look at Ferguson, you look at Baltimore, and I've been at pretty much all of these demonstrations. I'll be down in Maryland next week. But when you look at some of the signs, some of the, you know, I don't want to call it rhetoric, but when you look at some of the chants and things of that sort, they are starting to contextualize the system in this kind of way, right? That it's immoral and that it's not legitimate, and therefore we should just outright reject it. And everything that's attached to it, that's including prisons, right? Even these re-entry programs that make money, just like private prisons, off so-called criminals, and does nothing to rehabilitate them, because in capitalism, what do you have to do? You want to ensure profit. So certainly, I'm not going to rehabilitate you, because I want you to go back out there and come back tomorrow if you can, right? That's the only way I'm going to make money, if you come back tomorrow, or even an hour after I release you. And so the moral compass is lost. It doesn't exist. I don't really know if it had ever existed, frankly, right? Because the criminal justice system for black people started in slavery. So these killings, you know, this slogan, Black Lives Matter, is not something that is essentially contemporary. This has always, in fact, it started on the slave ships, right? So this didn't begin with Mike Brown and Vanderet Myers and Rakia Boyd. You know, again, there's this emphasis on black males, but black women too have been increasingly victims of this kind of violence. But we need to again remind people that it didn't start today. This has been a long-standing and essentially an American thing, right? But I'm just happy to see that, you know, there is this sort of movement going, right? There is some momentum. People are waking up, including a lot of mainstreamers, right? I work in the criminal justice department, and I had one of my colleagues said, I didn't hear it, he said it to someone else, but when they were out here protesting the Eric Gardner situation, again, another case that should shock the moral consciousness of anybody. We saw this man murdered this Gardner on tape, and yet the so-called justice system You know, it completely failed us there. But anywho, he said something to the effect that, I wonder why there are a lot of white people out there. Yeah, one of my colleagues. Yeah. As Sean said, criminology and criminal justice departments they tend to be really conservative, some of them. Luckily for me, with my undergraduate and master's, I had Dr. Calathes, so I didn't have to go through much of that. But around the country, they tend to be really conservative for the most part. In fact, my first time coming here and sitting on a panel, some people couldn't believe it. They were like, criminal justice, what? And I had to explain to them, you do have critical and radical criminologists and so forth and so on. We're all not conservative and the same, but nevertheless, you know, this guy was a cop for a couple of years. He was an ex-police chief or whatnot. But it was interesting to hear that he said he didn't understand why there were whites out there marching in defense of Eric Gardner. Incredible. I mean, it's something that you almost don't even have a response to. You know, it's like, what? You know, but it's a new age, so I'm happy to see that there is some momentum, that people are marching, and that, you know, many times the crowds are largely filled with mainstream bodies. And so that's a really good thing. Really good thing.
And I'm gonna be really transparent. I'm not a criminologist. I don't consider myself a criminologist. I'm just a black girl from the Bronx, really. That's like what I like to tell people. Like, I think most of my knowledge and wisdom has been like passed down from people that I grew up around in my neighborhood, young folks that I work with. That's actually my dad at the end. So I learned a lot from him too. No, Sean is just my friend. The guy all the way at the end is my dad. And so there's like 5 really quick points I want to make, but I just want to like be really upfront with, I don't consider myself a criminologist or an academic. So the first point is I wanted to do some like locating for us. You know, I think a lot of people I've heard have opinions about the Left Forum being held at John Jay. You know, I think that like we're in a space that like Monday through Friday is often filled with people who are training to be cops, right? That we've seen like throughout the CUNY system, more and more divergent to the right, right? More and more processes of privatization. I think over the past 15 years, the amount of people who are working class, black and brown from New York City has actually decreased. We are like all sitting, living, breathing in like a settler state. That this is stolen land, land that has like a long history before any sky rises were built. So just to understand that like where we are has many layers of dispossession. So when we're talking about like indictment, to understand that we're all complicit in that in some way, right? So that's kind of like the first point. The second point I wanted to make was a note on language. So I put some stuff up on the board. So people use all types of words. I would really like to push us to use humanizing language. There's an amazing paper written by Eddie Ellis, who recently passed away, who was a Black Panther, a former political prisoner, and came out and was an amazing organizer, but talks about using humanizing language. So instead of saying criminal justice system or juvenile justice system, say injustice system. Instead of saying criminal, convict, inmate, right? People who are formerly incarcerated, people who are system impacted, people with documented records. And then particularly, I work with an organization in Los Angeles that works with what people would consider gang members. We do not use the term gang, understanding that it is something that is socially constructed, often constructed by the police. So we use the term neighborhood affiliated or street family. Right, so just thinking about when we do open this up for discussion, being really intentional about language. We are not monsters, right? Which is like something that young people I work with all the time say. And I will have to push back on Jason that it's also important not to pathologize people who are system impacted. I know plenty of people who have diseases, who have, you know, emotional issues, and who have been raped who are not in prison, right? So not to understand that like, people who are behind bars are coming and like, you know, creating like havoc and are pathologized by a system because this is a system that we're all affected by, whether we've spent time behind bars or not. I'm going to talk really specifically about an organization called the Youth Justice Coalition, which is located in South Los Angeles. Has anyone been to South LA? South Central, Inglewood?
Until a year ago.
Dope. Okay. Anyone else? Anyone else? Okay, long ago. So, you know, if you have any questions about the context, like shoot up your hand, you know, feel free, jump in, whatever, if something doesn't make sense. But we're an organization that does a whole bunch of things. We were started about 13 years ago, and we work primarily, all of the people who run the organization, who are a part of it, are system impacted, and we work with young people who are also system impacted. So we do direct action organizing, we do court support, we have a school called Free LA High School, which stands for Fighting for the Revolution to Educate and Empower Los Angeles. And we're a school that's predominantly for young people who are coming home from lockup. And we're also a school that is committed to dismantling the school to jail track. So we don't have any security officers. We don't have any metal detectors. We do not expel. We do not suspend. We have no type of punitive system in our school. Instead, we have like a peace builder who's like an OG in the neighborhood, somebody who, what we call a liberated lifer, so who spent many years being locked up and is now back in the community using his wisdom, right, to build peace in the street and in our school. And all of our curriculum is tailored to and around community organizing. Right, so when we're talking about, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in a little bit, but when we talk about hope, right, like thinking about models that are really divesting from a system and building something new, and hold on, I'm gonna get to you in 1 second, and trying to create like really viable alternatives.
Does the school have any official recognition?
Yeah, I mean, we award high school diplomas, so it's a continuation school. We're 16 through 24 years old. It isn't a GED program, so it's a charter school, which often means as a charter that's continuation that is for people who are system impacted, we're like desperately underfunded. You know, we don't have like a science lab, we don't have like, you know, a real gymnasium, a real library, but we have young people who have been literally banned from entire school districts, and this is kind of their last stop in being able to get a high school diploma.
Have you graduated many classes yet?
Yeah, so we've graduated over 100 students, which is like really phenomenal because a lot of our students, not only beyond being system impacted, are young parents, have been involved in the foster care system, are homeless, I mean, have a whole bunch of, are trans, are experiencing violence in the streets. And so it's, I mean, of course I want to gas it up because I work there, but it really is like a phenomenal place. Yeah, so we have people going on to two-year institutions and 4-year institutions later on. But it's also a struggle, right? The struggle doesn't stop once people get high school diplomas, and none of those things that are challenges stop either, right? Just because a young person was locked up when they're 15 also doesn't mean that they're not stopped and caught up in the system again when they're 21, 30, you know. We know sort of how like the injustice system has really long-reaching tentacles for all of us. And so we do a whole bunch of things, but that's the place that I'm speaking from, and that's the sort of, I guess, knowledge I want to share with you guys today. And so the fourth point is when I think about indictment and when we think about indicting the American criminal justice system, you know, there's a lot to indict, which is, you know, I think an interesting thing to consider, especially when you're talking, for me personally, from like an abolitionist standpoint or framework, is, you know, I want to share sort of a couple of things from my organization and my experience working in LA that I think sort of speak to the idea of why abolition isn't just about eliminating police, right? When we think about abolition, it isn't just that there should be no prison walls, right? Because that's a really simple understanding of the way the prison industrial complex works and the way policing works, the way surveillance, the way the injustice system, I think, affects every aspect of society, right? Especially when we think about like the really hyper punitive nature in the US context. So again, these are like just almost like little vignettes. I'm sure like all of you guys also have like examples and personal knowledge that can like contribute to the conversation that we would love to hear. So the first is, you know, in LA County, first of all, in the state of California, in the past 30 years, 22 new prisons have been built and only 3 universities. So California, and I think specifically for my organization, particularly Los Angeles, we think about if we free LA, then we free the rest of the country, right? Because not only is California addicted to incarceration, but over 75% of the state's prisons are filled with people from LA. New York, obviously, 7 neighborhood study that was actually, you know, begun by Eddie Ellis that showed that 80% of the prison population upstate comes from like 7 zip codes that are all based in New York City. So very similar in California state. California also used to be number 1 in public education. It is now number 50. So like a really dire situation, and LA law enforcement, LAPD, and also, you know, there's the city of LA, there's also the county, which has a whole bunch of different, almost like patchwork police departments, if anyone knows anything about sort of like the massive geographic nature of LA County, that LAPD and the sheriffs of LA County actually end up exporting a lot of their tactics to other parts of the country and other parts of the world. So being able to also think about it as a hub for like the punishment industry. So recently, my organization did, we have a research component to our work, and we did a report that found that since the year 2000, over 600 people have been killed by law enforcement in LA County. We recently had a march that we called Remember Me, and actually made coffins and painted them for every single person that was killed by law enforcement since the year 2000. And it's interesting because LA County has the highest number of civilian killings by law enforcement in the country, but people really fail to recognize that. In our center alone, in the past 5 years, we've had to bury 60 young people due to either street violence or violence from law enforcement, which is really big. We're not like a massive organization, right? We have about 100 students enrolled. And it's interesting because we are a nonprofit, and not any single foundation who funds us has sent us a card acknowledging like the death of any of our young people, has contributed a single dollar to funeral expenses, or has even sent like a bouquet of flowers. Right, so and I'm saying this when we think about indictment, right? Because it isn't just law enforcement, right, that needs to be indicted. It isn't just the injustice system that needs to be indicted, right? That they're all things that we're complicit in thinking about how we perpetuate some of like this nasty language instead of like moving towards a more humanizing practice. LA is also home in California, but it started in LA, to something called the Cal Gang Database, which was created in the 1980s and is, you know, now a statewide database that holds the names of alleged gang members. The database is completely secret, and for a long time you couldn't know whether you were on it, and there was no process of removal. It does have material consequences, so you can get denied public housing or denied like jobs, government jobs or city jobs, county jobs. And you know, my organization did put in a FOIA request to say like, well, you know, who's on this database, right? Because if you're in it, you don't know, but yet it's a statewide database, so anywhere you go across the state, if law enforcement punches in your name, then you're an affiliated gang, considered an affiliated gang member. So when we combed through some of the files, we found that people as young as 9 years old were on the database, and people who had already died were in the database. So like even in death were considered gang members. And so, you know, when we think about I will admit, I am in graduate school. I'm a PhD student, which is like kind of a nasty thing. But when we think about research, right, and we think about like big data, this is also an example of sort of like the conflation of crunching numbers, of data collection that can come into the crosshairs of surveillance and the injustice system. LA is also home to the birth of gang injunctions. So gang injunctions are essentially civil suits that a city or a county can put against people that they think are gang members. And so police will say, okay, this area is really high crime, and all the people in that back row are considered gang members. Maybe we know this because they're on the database. So we're gonna draw a red line around this neighborhood, and all of you guys, we're putting you on this injunction, which means that we consider you gang members, we consider you contributing to the violence of this area. You're not allowed to wear certain colors. You're not allowed to talk to any of each other. You can't be seen in public with 3 or more people, and all of you have to be home, right, no later than 8 p.m. and cannot be out before 7 a.m. So you have a curfew. And you can't live with anyone who also is considered gang affiliated. So just because you two are brothers and you live together, you're both on the suit. If you live together, you're both arrested. There are people, including my organization, the Justice Coalition, that are trying to, go through like litigation processes to challenge gang injunctions, but it's a really slow process. And the only sort of like litigious victory we've had has been around the curfew, and you can't do it across multiple gang injunctions. So there's, that you have to do one injunction at a time. There's like over 100 gang injunctions in LA County alone, right? Which is crazy, right? And so a really, really dear friend of mine, she's an amazing scholar, her name is Ana Muñiz, I'm gonna write her name on the board because she's just that fabulous. She did research on gang injunctions and found that gang injunctions actually aren't put in high crime neighborhoods. And they're also not made specifically like through the avenue of law enforcement. They're actually created when law enforcement and attorneys and urban developers come together in backroom conversations and put gang injunctions in neighborhoods that are neighboring areas that are about to be gentrified or in areas that are currently undergoing gentrification, right? So they're also a tool for like urban redevelopment and a really backhanded way of rezoning areas. Yeah. So again, when we talk about indictment, right, that it isn't just thinking about how people who are like really directly system impacted, right, in terms of like spending time behind bars are affected, but it's all of us, right? And it is a question of Black Lives Matter, but it also is really intersectional in terms of poor lives, brown lives, undocumented lives, that these are things that we have to consider. So there are like 100 other examples I could give. And one is a more personal example. So I've worked with the YJC for about 6 years now. One of my very first students at the high school, and a really amazing young man, after he graduated, he was on the gang database, which he didn't know, right, because it's a secret file, nobody knows, and had some previous contact as a juvenile with the system, was found with a very, very, very small pocket knife. Now, in California, there are really real mandatory sentencing laws. So you have mandatory sentencing for guns, for gangs, for how long this knife is. So all of those things tacked up, the knife was no bigger than my hand, right? But because he's a young Black man in South Central, right, gets stopped because he had contact with the system before, because he's considered a gang member, because the knife is like just a few centimeters longer than what is legally allowed, he ends up getting 15 plus years in state prison. And I'm not saying this to like sensationalize, I don't want this to be like some poverty pimping, like urban save the children example. But again, like, I don't consider myself a criminologist because I think, right, like, people like Donnie, like this young student, have been criminologists for like a really long time, right? Like, understand how crime is constructed for like a really long time. And until we're like considering, you know, like my neighbor, I live in Harlem, you know, who has been like stopped and frisked like hundreds of times, until like he's considered a criminologist, like that's not necessarily a label I feel okay saying because like I'm a graduate student. And so, right, when we think about an indictment of the system, I think it is really important to also understand like what does hope mean, right? Because this stuff is really real, really heavy. And so I want to give sort of like a brief outline of kind of our approach to this, because we are a prison abolitionist organization and we take the charge very seriously around thinking about alternatives. So through all of this stuff, we practice something that we call transformative justice. And transformative justice, in some ways, is related to restorative justice. I don't know, people could have different relationships with RJ. They are slightly different, right? But it's the idea that you can handle conflict in non-punitive terms. Now, restorative justice, these that have never had it, as a practice, restorative justice often tends to still be run by people who are not directly impacted by issues or not directly system impacted, or often run by social workers or actual law enforcement personnel. So it can end up widening the net of people who are system impacted because certain RJ programs are really prescriptive. And if you don't go through the process in a certain way, then you're funneled back into court, right? Traditional RJ also uses like victim perpetrator binaries. In our organization and through a transformative justice lens. I'm so sorry, excuse me. Oh, that bodega coffee got me all tore up. That we actually urge people to erase that binary, right? Because we are all victims or we're all perpetrators at one point in time. And traditional restorative justice is, at the root, is about solving interpersonal conflict, not systematic conflict. Right, so from a transformative justice lens, every single conflict that occurs, we're thinking about its systematic roots, right? So small conflicts in our school are handled through a transformative justice circle. So tiny things like students who are perpetually late, or if people get into a fist fight, or if something is stolen. Right, we don't expel, we're not about punishment, but we're really trying to think about having conversations around what are the underlying causes of those things. As we had a young person who was a student who had done some recruiting in our school for another student to go across the border and bring drugs in a car. The student who had done it was a young mom, and she ended up getting stopped by the police. Her son was in the car. She was arrested, and he was put, into the system for a couple of days. And so the student who had done the recruiting, we had a transformative justice process with him. We brought his family in, and we, in traditional schooling, right, cops would be called, but he's undocumented, right? So calling police has like vast repercussions in his family. And it also would interrupt his learning and interrupt his own process of transformation. And so through like really deep conversation with him and trying to talk about accountability, when we came up with collective agreements about like what should be done, right? One of our biggest points was, you are having like a sort of a blinded understanding of like what vulnerability means. You're recruiting somebody who's like a young mom, right? The number one thing that's stolen in convenience stores in South LA by women is baby formula. So let's really think about, right, how you're harping on a situation that really is gendered, classed, and raced. And so what you have to do in order to make amends, in order to repair the harm, is you have to, financially give a contribution to support this child for the next 6 months, right? You have to help this mom out financially. You have to volunteer at a hospital where young women give birth to babies who are drug addicted. We also have to support us when we do outreach in the women's prisons, right? To understand actually what it means to be a woman locked up behind bars. So really thinking about how can we solve conflict in ways that are deeper than just on an interpersonal level. And so how that kind of translates into our larger scale work is, you know, when you talk about prison abolition, when you talk about, I think like imagination, Robin Kelley has a great book, Dream something, 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 but it has Black radical imagination in it. And part of what he talks about, or radical Black, whatever, it has the word imagination in it. And part of what he talks about is how do you not measure social movements by if they accomplished what they set out to do, right? What their initial goals were. Because if we measured social movements by that, then every social movement is a failure. Because we never really accomplished what we set out to do, which, you know, I think isn't a testament to our hard work. It's a testament, right, to like the deep corruption of like the society that we live in. But how do we start measuring social movements by how big and beautiful and creative their dreams of a new world are, right? So how do we start thinking about it through that lens? And then in that ways, like there are tons of social movements that have been incredibly successful. So part of our dream is bringing like really real material changes to LA County, but also into sort of thinking about what does justice reinvestment look like. We did some research and said, okay, how much money goes into locking young people up? So we did the budget of the prosecutor, of probation, of the court system, juvenile court system, and all the county lockups for young people. It's a lot of money. And we found that 1% of that, it's $100 million.
It's 1%.
It's just 1%. Instead of locking young people up, can we redirect 1% into youth development? Right, that this is what transformative justice looks like. So with $100 million, you can open 50 youth centers, have 500 full-time peace builders and intervention workers, and have 25,000 youth jobs, all on $100 million with just 1%. I really want to like beg us and challenge us to think about like really concretized ways of being imaginative, right? Of having radical dreams, and also like divesting from a system that we all know isn't working from us. We can get so consumed with holding a system accountable that will never hold us accountable that we leave like no time to actually practice any alternatives or to like work on building radical and collective dreams. So I'm gonna shut up, that was a lot. I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything, but I think we want to open it up if you have questions or discussion. But thank you all. That was a lot of listening.
Yeah, I certainly want to thank Sean, Jason, and Whitney for their wonderful contributions this morning. And I want to take a risk of actually saying something wrong before I open it up. And as a Greek American, I'm going to be overly dramatic for a second. It's part of my nature and my culture. Certainly, if I walk across the street on 59th Street right now, in terms of getting my car later on, and I get killed by a hit and run, and I'm dead on the floor there on 59th Street right in front of John Jay, it won't matter. Because having learned so much, not only this morning, but even before this morning, from two of my former students, Sean and Jason, and from my daughter, I know that my life means everything now, because to be a professor and to be a father and to come to the moment where you know that you've learned more from your students and from your daughter than you could ever taught them, then I'll die a happy man. Okay, so thank you very much. It was a little bit overly dramatic, so let me open it up to all of you, and let's have a discussion.
I'm interested in this gang member list, is that only in California? And if the people, how they define a gang member? Do we have gang members here, a list also? And can they find out, or the lawyers somehow, officially if they are gang members or not?
Yeah,
I never heard about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, a lot of people haven't heard of it because it's like one of the most secretive, like extensive databases in the world. So I do know that it's been exported to places like Canada and other places in the world. I know when it originally started in the 80s, it was kind of like beefed up by our favorite boy, William Bratton, who had a stint in LA about 10 years ago. So I'm sure like wherever he's gone, he's like pulled it with him. I don't know for sure if there's something like that exists in New York. I do think, there's a certain mythology and like creation of spectacle around gang culture in Los Angeles that doesn't exist in a place like New York City. I think it does in places like Chicago, New Orleans, maybe even Miami a little bit. So I wouldn't be surprised if a database like that existed. I do know in New York that Bratton has talked about eliminating gang members as one of his #1 priorities. There is a special task force in the NYPD called Operation Crew Cut that primarily has law enforcement officials surveilling young people on social media. So they will create fake Instagram profiles, fake Facebook, fake Twitter accounts to then befriend young folks that they think are in crews or what also would be known as gangs and surveil them that way. So I'm sure that's also a way that like lots of data is being kept and monitored around young folks. But again, like this idea of a gang is completely mythical, right? So to even think like, do we have gang members in New York? Like, yeah, we have like young Black and brown people that are part of street families that like build with their neighbors, that grow up with people and have like some sort of shared identity with each other. I don't know if I would call that a gang, but I think surveillance is really deep, and I think it's always important for us to like take these things that become factual to us and understand how they're created and what like infrastructure goes into creating them. So I think it would be really interesting for somebody to like even just take the idea of a gang and see how it's like been manifested and like reiterated in New York over time, and sort of see what comes up. I will also say, also as like a challenge around language, we're really quick as a country to talk about gang members, and yet overseas like support child soldiers, which are like part of areas that have war, young people that are like put into organizations that commit violence, and like people who are child soldiers are often considered victims, and young people who are considered gang members are often considered perpetrators, when really there isn't that much difference structurally between like what goes into creating them. So I think even any investigatory work around gangs in New York is also like, not to sound too academic-y, but like semiotic, is about like language and what gets labeled as what and like the power of words. But all I know is about Operation Crew Cut, but I'm sure there's something else too. I wouldn't be surprised.
Fantastic, yes.
I have a couple comments. So since we're
Maybe you can tell us your name and.
My name is Maya. I'm sorry.
Hi, Maya.
Since we're on the topic of gangs, I think it's really interesting. I just took a course, I think it was in the fall semester, and this was my last year of criminal justice undergraduate studies, so I'm in advanced courses at this point. And we're talking about gangs in an online class. So the lesson was broken up based on the races of different gangs and how they operate by race. So I brought that to the attention of the professor and I asked him, why did you make your PowerPoint in that way? I don't understand what the relevance of that lesson and why you said that African American gangs are violent and they're in prisons and the Asian gangs are more prominent in California. He just had all these theories about gangs that were just so irrelevant. I couldn't believe that this was possibly overviewed by the head of the department and why that was okay. And then the white gangs were the mob and the Italian mobsters. It was just so stereotypical, and people were literally writing posts on the discussion board, students, and they were just summarizing the PowerPoint and going off what the professor said. And I just could not believe that we were talking about that in an advanced level criminal justice course in Farleigh Dickinson, which is a pretty prestigious university to many people who haven't been there. And then my other comment was on the ethics and morality, which you were talking about, Dr. Williams. Another course, which was a graduate course that I took, was ethics and criminal justice, which was a pretty lower level course. This was my first year of the graduate studies, and there was a lot of topics on removing morality from the criminal justice system and from legislature. And again, I couldn't understand why we were trying to remove that aspect when we're so closely embedded with morality and ethics in the criminal justice system. We have to when we're dealing with people's lives. Why we're trying to remove the ethical component of criminal justice? Are we trying to just dehumanize criminals and take away that guilt of microaggressions and implicit bias? So I thought that was really interesting that you guys brought that up, because it paralleled what I had just learned in my classes, and I learned the opposite. I didn't learn it, I knew it already, but.
Can I ask you something? If you were to reteach those classes, and you were create the syllabus, lead a lecture, how would you go about it?
Well, for the, I don't even remember what the class was that I took about, we were talking about gangs. I don't remember at this point, I just erased it out of my mind. But I think that I would do it more from an approach of language and how we can train criminal justice practitioners to rehumanize criminals, because I heard the term criminal so many times, and I'm just like, well, what is a criminal? What does a criminal look like? Which is that, are they black? Are they brown? Are they trans? Are they whatever people are labeled as criminals? So I would take it from a language perspective and take that approach, because that is really harmful in the criminal justice system and in classrooms, because you have people who are coming to John Jay and to FDU and learning how to be a racist practitioner.
Well,
I don't think they need to learn how to they're coming from a.
Yeah,
But it's perpetuated. It's
Yeah.
perpetuated in the classroom, and this was something that we always spoke
Yeah,
about
we
too
talked
at
about that.
NJCU.
Yeah.
And he made accommodations for us. You know, he would introduce courses that he knew we would want. I mean, he introduced me to several books that sparked my interest, you know, in radical criminality.
You are doing for
Yeah,
me. You have done for
but
me.
Maya, you know, it's
Professors like you and Dr. Garcia, Dr. Ford, all of our tenured lecturers are people of color, primarily women of color, but all of our adjuncts are white males, and they teach the majority of the classes, which I had a problem with, and I noted that in that survey that they just emailed to us. I absolutely voiced that, because I think that our professors of color should be teaching, especially the radical courses, because the other ones are just talking about nonsense, and I'm just like, you're wasting my time. Like, I got a job and I got to go to work, and I don't want to listen to this right now. So, you know, that's another thing with us perpetuating the system of injustice.
Yeah, and there is a deep element of complicity in that, because what occurs is that the literature, the traditional literature, which is mass marketed and pushed. I mean, I've been around now for 28 years, and you know, the publishing companies have, you know, bought each other up, and oftentimes they package materials, and then professors of privilege have a very easy perspective without doing the research and just sort of consuming what they're given, and then without realizing that they're actually part of the problem, teaching from Howard Aberdinski's Organized Crime book. Which breaks down, I don't know if that was the book, but certainly many organized crime books, maybe 95% of them, are actually structured in that kind of reactionary framework. So it really is a massive problem in academia to some extent, but it does come from a position of power and privilege, because it's less taxing to do the additional work. And it's also a re-identification of who you are in terms of the kind of critical approach you have to take in terms of really teaching about the kinds of things that we've heard today. So, yeah. Tell us your name.
Anita. I mean, one of the things I was writing comments and I thought, I'm going to break down in tears and I don't want to, so I'm trying not to.
It's okay to cry.
But I wondered when you were talking about going to Ferguson and going to Baltimore, if you personally were stopped at any point. I'll give an example, the reason I'm asking.
Yeah, no, I wasn't. I think at that time they were really trying to be a little bit low key, you know. Although there were moments when you seen the cops, riding around and things like that. So that was a little intimidating because at the time they weren't like your traditional police cars. These were like trucks. So a little intimidating, But at the time, no, I wasn't stopped. But you felt it in the air because I went down several times before you came with me. But you can feel the tension in the
because that was one of the
air.
things. I mean, we're going back to the early '90s when I was a chief of the settlement division for the controller's office here, and I had a staff of attorneys. And one of the African American attorneys that worked for me, she and her husband were coming back from the airport, stopped for absolutely no reason at all. Just the color of their skin. So I see this in such a historical context because the comments I was making, gang injunctions, more so ghetto. Doing my job. The Nazis, I was doing my job.
Well, it reminds me of the passing papers, right? Back during the slave codes, the black codes and whatnot. You can't travel without being validated, by the system. It's incredible. And I think that's part of sort of shifting the paradigm to one of a moralistic framework, looking at it from that context, and questioning, is it moral for people to be pulled over for no reason? This majoritarian trickery, the legality of justice, is it something that we should accept when you have people being, treated in these ways? It's incredible.
The whole concept of stop and frisk was supposed to be for the officer's safety, and they would do a pat down and leave you alone if it wasn't a gun or something. But it's
But now they use it for an investigative, they use it to control crime or whatnot, but which wasn't its original intention. But the Supreme Court of this country has done more to harm us than help.
I mean, is there a Bill of Rights anymore?
No. But there never was one. I would argue, and in the urban community and black communities in the ghettos, we never really were able to accomplish that ever since the 13th Amendment. Because right after we were supposedly freed, here came the black codes.
I had a friend who was a criminal defense attorney, and she just said the cops just lie. They cover their tracks and they lie. So.
Yeah, but what's really interesting about that is that we've sort of been complaining about this forever, but no one believes it. And that's the thing. No one really want to believe it. But when you have the DOJ report come out, you have the report out of Cleveland soon. I think that's going to be when you have these kinds of reports. Really, then suddenly people wake up to it. But even then, those who wake up to it is not enough to really make a change, because most people still see the legitimacy of the system through use of stereotypes, bias, and things of that sort, right? So these are the criminals, and I've heard many times, if you don't have anything on you, you have nothing to worry about.
Let's hear from, tell us your name again, then we'll come back down here.
Okay. I think maybe the group of radical criminologists should focus all their attention on making studies of white communities, because now everything is in the air, unlike 3 years ago. But I think to get more public support for this, studies of how whites have been victimized probably is going to be very important. Anyway, just a thought. But I just have three very specific questions on what you said. Just like the name of your school.
Oh, Free LA. I'll write it down. Free LA.
And the two factual points you mentioned. You said Los Angeles County has the highest number of civilian killings?
By law enforcement.
By law enforcement, okay. And you also said that California is now the 50th state in education. No, in what's the criteria for the amount of money spent per student? Or what is
quality? I think it's a whole bunch of factors. I don't know off the top of my head. But if you go, I'm sure I hate to Google it. But I think it's a mass
holistic. Sometimes
This was like
based
a
on.
particular study that was done?
No, I mean, it's like federal rankings.
Federal.
Yeah, federal.
So it's federal.
Yeah. Go ahead. Oh, he had one other.
I just,
you have one other
I just wanted to
question?
add on to your question about crime and like white crime. Well, actually, Walter D. Casaretti, who's a criminologist, he writes a lot on rural crime, and he recently just published a book. And actually, like there's a lot of myths about crime in rural settings. Because if you look at criminology, a lot of criminology literature is based on inner city crime, but there's actually a lot of crime in rural areas as far as like domestic violence, drug use, and actually like as far as like burglary, the burglary rates are a lot higher in rural settings than they are in inner city settings. So there's a lot of misconceptions about crime that a lot of criminologists write about, and there are actually scholars who do touch on rural crime, but it's kind of a marginalized topic in criminology.
I guess I wasn't clear.
Okay.
What I meant to say was the victimization of whites by the police or by the system.
Oh, I see what you mean.
That's, sorry, I wasn't clear. So, you had mentioned studies. So if that can be
Yeah.
shown to be widespread, I
Well,
think that's a way of getting people, white people.
Yeah, theoretically merging, all of our victimizations, and that's why I spoke to the intercontextuality of this, because, I mean, the numbers are there, so we know that whites are victimized as well, probably not at the larger rates than, people of color, but it exists, right? So, I mean, it can be him today, but you tomorrow, So, yeah, I think that needs to be done, both within criminological context, but also just within, leftist sort of discourses and discussions, because, you have a lot of people out here walking around, and they don't think this stuff, can affect them. But it does. I mean, I see almost every week, videos of whites, too, being beaten by the police and things of that sort.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And even in rural settings, there's this buddy network between a lot of men who abuse their wives with police officers. So their abuse is kind of swept under the rug. And a lot of times rural women are victimized by, both the justice system and their, significant others. So that's another huge issue that needs to be addressed as well.
Yeah, downplaying, white victimization does not help the white community either. So that could be another way, right, within which we can merge them together and bring about a greater consciousness.
I mean, I would disagree because I think there's plenty of white victimization. I think like every time a young white girl goes missing, it's like a huge phenomenon. I think like the idea that white people are losing jobs, I think the idea that white people don't live in safe neighborhoods, I think the idea that, white people might be the racial minority at some point in life. I think there's like plenty, like an overabundance of white victimization. So I would actually disagree with that. I also don't know how much it helps to broaden the net of who is a victim, right? Especially because I think pointing out who gets brutalized is important, but I think it also doesn't hit to the root of we shouldn't have police, right? I don't think it actually works to hold police accountable as much as, my fear would be like, oh, boo-hoo, poor white people. So I have mixed feelings about it. I also think the fact that I think things are like really intersectional. So I think like race, while an important element, like should always be cross-cut with like gender, sexuality, citizenship, class, able-bodiedness. And I think if we just leave it as whiteness, when people think of whiteness, they're thinking of like straight, middle-class, heterosexual, Christian white men. And I think we have to complicate that a little bit more, especially because even if that group of whiteness was considered to be police, that like doesn't prevent them from getting jobs or being able to have more access to housing or getting paid at higher rates, so I think it doesn't really speak to deeper systematic inequality. I also think like the creation of police was started by slave patrols. There's a really, really good book. I don't remember the sister's name. It's called Slave Patrols, and it has like a very specific date, but she's a historian and documents slave patrols in the militia in the Virginias, I want to say.
Yeah, that's the book. I forget.
But what's her name?
I forget the name, but if you go on to Amazon.
Yeah. And just, it's like a really, I mean, it's thick. It's super historical. but just talks about the connection between like militia, slave patrols, and like modern day policing.
Well, to add to it, the reason why I said to include it is because if you're going to have right now we have a problem with white consciousness, with waking up white people. So part of that process obviously would be to educate them, right? Okay, so when we're looking at rates, right, blacks and Latinos, whomever, people of color are more likely to be impacted by this. However, it happens to you as well. So I see it as a tool of awakening the consciousness of perhaps even a sleeping giant, right? Because I mean, if these people woke up and realized, it's the same thing with class warfare, right? Only if they knew, right? If they only woke up and realized that they were under attack just like the rest of us, then maybe they'll come together, right? And while understanding still that these people have been suffering since the beginning, right? Their suffering is much more larger, much more humane, but nevertheless will come together with us and help propel this movement forward, right? I don't say that as if to suppose that, you know, we need to therefore then downplay the suffering, right, of blacks, right, and what that means, and you know, and the duration of that. No, but rather just to help to awaken their consciousness. Right, but again, part of that problem needs to be this sort of educational mechanism as well, right? So that, for example, yeah, come, you know, you can come into this circle as an ally, right? But you need to understand too these sort of intersectional contexts, right? That these people have been suffering more and so forth and so on. But that's why, if that gives clarity to your.
Well, yeah. Before I recognize Fatma and then some other comment, I just want to mention one thing about making alliances. That one of the things that is often overlooked is the aspect of comfort that comes with power and privilege. And we mentioned something about criminal justice textbooks, a course that you had this past semester. You know, the vast majority of criminal justice students in academia learn about the police from Peelian principles. And when I teach community policing, I Xerox Peelian principles and I tear them up and I throw them out to students. And I tell them that this type of propagandized history is just an actual aspect of the comfort that comes with the power and privilege that has to be rejected. So it's really important to be able to think about aspects of social psychological comfort that comes from passive collaboration, which is a real important term to understand. It's not just complicitives, it's actually a passive collaboration that comes with reaping benefits from power and privilege. That's important in every aspect, not just in academic life, but in just walking the streets and getting up in the morning. Fatma, and then, yes, Fatma.
Hi, my name is Fatma. I'm a former student of Richard-Callathes. I know Shan, he's my classmate. Jason taught me once. I know Whitney from her activist, Occupy Wall Street.
Oh, that's right.
Yes. And why do I come here? Because I learn from here what I don't hear from the media, what I don't read in the textbooks. That's why I come to the left fork. I learn a lot from here. It's like I come to the real world. I just want to add something about what Whitney said about the profits that they make from the prison system. 80% of this profit goes to Republicans. That's my opinion. We don't know. I mean, who benefit from this? Republicans, yeah. I read an article, 80% of the profit of the prison system goes to Republicans. Another thing, what I learned from the latest, that New York and California, they cut the funds from education and they transfer them to the criminal justice system. And when I invite students, I tell them, come to the criminal justice system, take criminal justice, study criminal justice, because we have a lot of money, we're gonna get jobs. What I mean, that's what I tell them, because they are desperate to find jobs. But I want them to learn more about the criminal justice system, how, once they take classes, I know that they're gonna make changes. They're gonna, have another, perspective to the criminal justice system. And my question to Jason or Dr. Williams, if we, I thought about this question before, when we abolish prisons, if we do, what we're gonna do with people who commit first-degree murder or with felonies? How can we approach this problem.
Yeah, I think, well,
I have a quick question. Can we hear the other two questions too? Because I saw two other hands, and then can we answer all three of them? Is that okay?
great, yeah, that's
Yeah,
good.
we saw this hand first. Tell us who you are.
I'm Safi Nairobi, producer with KPFA Radio Berkeley, KPOO Radio San Francisco. And I would first like to share a brief experience with you and then follow that with a question if you don't mind. Yesterday, during one of the panels, we got a telephone call from a woman who works for a car dealership in Northern California.
Can you speak louder?
Go in the back, I'm sorry.
We want to hear. You want a phone call?
You give her a mic.
No,
I don't know if there is a
that's
mic.
just recording. No, you can speak a little louder, perhaps.
Okay, we got a phone call from a woman who works for a car dealership, and that car dealership is under scrutiny for discriminatory practices with some other employees. So this sister is driving, and she uses her mobile phone as a GPS, puts it up, and is calculating wherever she's trying to go. She gets pulled over by the police, and she asked what she did wrong, and she said, oh, you know, I'm using this to navigate where I'm going. Then the officer says, well, your tail light is out. And she said, well, I work for a car dealership. This vehicle belongs to the company, and so what do you want me to do about it? Then he says, may I see your driver's license? So she's ex-Navy. She pulls out her driver's license, which is military, and he looks at it and says, well, why don't you have a California driver's license? And I don't know what explanation she gave for that. And then he goes on to say, well, I wonder what the Navy would say about that ring in your nose. So this just kept going on, and finally she started dialing to an attorney friend who I'm here with. And he says, what are you doing? She said, well, I'm recording this conversation. Somebody needs to know what you're doing. And then he threatened to call one of his colleagues. So this is just, it's like seemingly always they're looking for something to justify then taking somebody and locking them up, or just to continue to harass them. So my question is, are there any studies that you all are aware of, or you all have yourselves conducted, that indicate that what the difference is between black and brown men versus black and brown women being pulled over and harangued by police?
Should we answer that or take other questions?
Well,
and then we
we're
can-
just almost out of time, so could we hear the last question, and we could spend time answering all three? Is that
Okay, sounds good.
Well, I'll just keep it to
What's
a
your name?
comment, I guess.
What's your name?
My name's Lincoln.
Lincoln.
And I've been reading this year, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos of Community, Martin Luther King, and something you were saying earlier about the prison system and people coming out of the prison system reminded me of a passage I read recently that really struck me, where he's talking about the situation of black people in the South after emancipation, and I'm just going to read this part, so apologies for any un-PC terms that product time and all that. But so after formal end of slavery, 4 million newly liberated slaves found themselves with no bread to eat, no land to cultivate, no shelter to cover their heads. It was like freeing a man who had been unjustly imprisoned for years, and on discovering his innocence, sending him out with no bus fare to get home, no suit to cover his body, no financial compensation to atone for his long years of incarceration, and to help him get a sound footing in society, sending him out with only the assertion, now you are free. What greater injustice could society perpetrate? And I read that and I was like, my God, it's like he had a window into right now.
Thank you for sharing that.
Thanks as well. To answer your earlier question about the studies, I don't think that any of us right now, maybe I could be corrected, know specifically, but I know that the New Jersey State Attorney General's office had first conducted a massive study on pretext searches over about a 2 or 3 year period. I'm not sure whether or not they actually broke it down specifically in terms of gender, but from all accounts, it's been an increasing number of, wouldn't you say, Sean? An increasing number of women of color who have been stopped recently in terms of that, but I can't say that I know specifically of a criminological study that has actually looked just at that, but I think that from the stories that we've heard, similar to the one that you've shared with us, I think that it's an increasing number of women as well. Jason, would you?
Engendering racial injustice, so looking at that Black women's lives matter too, and also our research heavy, so might have some resources in terms of actual statistics.
Yeah, because those numbers do include women, right? We usually take the default sort of setting that, right, when we're talking about blacks being pulled over, it's all black men. But those numbers include black women as well. So it's important that we investigate that.
But police harassment of women have been a long-standing problem. In fact, Whitney, remember aspects in the south side of Chicago when you had worked with young women there?
Yeah, I did some work with an organization in Chicago and worked specifically with young women around their experiences with police. And I also think it's important, again, like I'm not a criminologist or an academic, also Hillary Potter's here and does stuff in terms of the intersection of like gender and criminology. So she might also be a resource too, if it's okay if I shout you out. But, you know, from my experience in working with young women, it also, we have to think about like how do we measure people's contact with the police? So like I've gotten stopped by the police and like been asked for my phone number. Had people say, oh, I want to put you in cuffs. What's your address? Can I see your ID? And don't worry, Dad, it's okay. And it was really similar for young women that I work with, right? When do you get off work? Oh, my shift ends at this time. But we don't see those as part of police violence. And often when we think about gendered oppression or gendered violence, that's just normal. Men are just being men, right? And it's part of like waking up and living in the world as a female-bodied person. And so I would also want us to be really critical that even when we look at numbers around like who is getting arrested, who gets stopped, like that there's a lot of stuff that isn't recorded that has like gendered components to it too.
Okay.
I also don't want to ignore Fatma's question about...
Fatma's question about the...
Just want to clear something. When I said Republican, that means they own corporations. That's what I meant. Not Republican as as own corporations.
And our question was around like if we don't have prisons, what happens to folks?
Violent criminals.
You know what? I think that when you look at much of the violent crime in this country, a lot of it does have to do with stress. Stress of living in a capitalistic society, and people just not really knowing how to channel their rage, if you will, properly. So I'll argue that part of abolishing prisons also comes with setting a framework for some kind of socialist society. And I think that if you equalize the playing field, if you equalize things, then you'll have, now look, some people may say, well, that's a theory, but I think you'll have less violence, frankly. Because I think oftentimes, and I think Durkheim wrote about this, right, in his announcement, oftentimes people commit these kinds of violence due to stressors that are attached to the broader ways in which society is run. Right? I mean, if you go into inner city, I grew up in a housing project, okay? So I have friends who still out on the streets now, still selling drugs, still doing, living that kind of life. I chose to go a different way, but I don't consider myself better or any different than they. But nevertheless, people often react to the conditions and circumstances in which they exist. Right? So if I don't have any opportunities from where I come from, because either I'm black, brown, poor, so forth, because of my social categorization, then I'm just going to find another way to do that. And I might go ahead and commit robbery or burglary, you know, and in the process shoot somebody. So I think a lot of these kinds of crimes, a lot of these kinds of things can be avoided if we actually did, you know, embrace a more socialistic kind of society. And because when you look at the use of the prisons today, it's really to just govern surplus populations, to govern the poor for the most part. So we don't need them. If they're going to exist for that sole purpose, which is their sole purpose, we should frame it in that sort of context, because that's what they do, right? We don't see people in Wall Street in those prisons. You know, what was her name? The woman, Martha Stewart. She didn't go to a regular prison. You see what I'm saying?
Or the banks.
So, yeah, we need to be very frank about the purpose of these prisons. And as they exist today, we need to just get rid of them because they're very violent. You know, they ruin lives.
My son told me 2 years ago, he answered this from his own point of view. He said, we're going to take them, the people who commit crime, take them to the park. And we're going to have like, you know, support in the park. And we're going to call them productive members, productive citizens. That's his
And your son is 10 years old.
Now, 2 years ago, he
No, as an 8-year-old, suggested that. Yeah, you had a comment?
Also, the vast number of people locked up are for drug offenses.
What he said, yeah.
Like, there's very few people who are
non-violent.
actually locked up for violent crimes. I also think it's like a horrible, horrible thing to distinguish between non-violent and violent offenses. There's like a bill in New York right now that is trying to raise the age around young people who can be tried as adults. But they're trying to say, well, let's raise the age, but not for people who commit violent offenses, and actually let's increase the punishment for young people who commit violent offenses.
And
So I just think it's like a very slippery slope to create that distinction.
And I think when we talk about prison abolition, it's important to look at the black prison uprisings and the political prisoners in the 60s and 70s, such as George Jackson, Eldridge Cleaver, Angela Davis, some of the literature that they published, and they were very radical. They talked about the system, and they produced a dialect of imprisoned bodies that captivated, you know, the country. And there was a lot of whites who were impressed and who also engaged in prison abolitionist work in the 60s and 70s. So I think it's important for us, if we really want to understand, if we really want to be able to contextualize what we can do to rid prisons, we need to look at some of the early prison organization and work. And a good book to look at is called the Spectacular, no, not the Spectacular Few, Captive Nation, but the Spectacular Few is good too, because it looks at prison radicalization, and it kind of gets into the minds of how prisoners are radicalized in the prison. But Captive Nation is also a good book to look at in regards to some of the ideologies that were fostered in the prison that looked at change and revolution.
All right, 2 more quick comments. Oh, you had your hand up as well. Yeah, may we hear from you first?
I just wanted to know if the Patriot Act has deteriorated the possibility of improving the system because people have no right to a lawyer like before when they stop. So he cannot prove that he didn't commit a crime, or maybe he's not the right person, he looks alike, and I don't know if they are trying to maintain the Patriot Act or eliminate, because sometimes they approve, I'm not a lawyer, so.
Well, you mentioned the Patriot Act.
Yes, that they change.
Well,
I mean, like they can take you in the street somewhere and without lawyer or anything that you, without any defense,
well,
no phone call, no nothing.
Rendition.
This may not be responsive exactly to your question, but I was a legal aid lawyer way back when, and I think there was a comment made by a number of attorneys in a couple of panels that I was at yesterday that spoke to the fact that the moment that you walk in as a legal aid lawyer in a major urban center, you're handed a case file of about 80 or 85 cases. So we could learn about aspects of representation in some ways, but aspects of reform have never really gotten any steam in any regard. So I wouldn't look towards aspects of reforming the system without actually thinking about eliminating. And the Patriot Act is a very complex act that has many different forms to it. So we can talk maybe after the panel. Yeah.
This is a footnote, a final footnote.
Sure.
I'm not a criminologist, but I've been interested in these issues. And about 30 years ago, I co-edited a book about radical Marxist scholarship in the United States, and there was a very interesting article about criminology by, I think, David Greenberg. I don't know
David
if he's
Greenberg,
regarded
yes,
as
that's the fellow.
Yeah. So this, I don't know if even the book is still in print, but I think it gives a very good introduction to Marxist criminology up to like 1985.
The name of the book?
The book is called The Left Academy. It's 3 volumes, and I don't even remember which volume this article was in because it's an anthology of 30 articles, each article on a different discipline.
We'll find
So
it.
David, yeah, and many libraries have it, but I think that would be a very good introduction to up to that point.
We'll find it. Maya, do you want to have the last word? Because we saw your hand, I saw your hand up a while ago. Did you have one last comment, and then we can end?
Provide a resource that I knew about Black women and police violence. I used it in my paper. I think it was Insight. There's an organization, Color and Violence, I think something like that, and they primarily focus on women of color being targeted by police. I can't remember the exact name, but if you Google that, it'll come right up.
Okay, well, I want Sean to talk about the next panel briefly, but I want to thank everyone for coming and